A note for High Noon listeners before we get to this week's episode. We try our best here at Independent Women's Forum to get crystal clear audio to you, but sometimes technology just doesn't cooperate with us. And this episode is one of those times where there can be some audio hiccups. I know as a listener how annoying that can be, but I really think this discussion with Aimee Terese on the psychology of the left and how our representatives and institutions understand victimhood and power is definitely worth powering through that annoyance. On that note, if you have kids listening to High Noon, first of all, I love that. But second, I did want to warn you that this episode does contain some language you might want to avoid them repeating. But with that, I hope you really enjoy this episode with Aimee Terese as much as I enjoyed talking with her. Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people, and nobody is more interesting than my guest this week, Aimee Terese. She is half of the formerly what was known as the What's Left podcast. She has a new podcast launching upcoming this year. She's a writer with Return and other magazines of dissidents against the leftist regime, and she is constantly banned on Twitter. You might have seen her takes on Twitter, but she's constantly getting kicked off. There seems to be an entire team at Twitter headquarters dedicated to making sure that Aimee Terese never gets to share her opinion on Twitter. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Aimee, is why do you think you're so constantly getting booted off of Twitter for saying things that, like, literally, I mean, you say them very well and eloquently, but tons of people say the same substance and don't get banned. They just really hate you.
I think I was chatting about this yesterday with Anna Katchin, and her theory is that, like, it's this whole, like, they hate you more if you're a traitor than if you were, like, never one of them. And so her thesis is that, like, anyone who's ever had anything to do with the left is basically, like, on their shit list for life if they dare to leave, like, if they dare to walk away. And so it sort of puts you in the crosshairs, all these little weirdos in who will, like, automatically get all of your tweets pumped into, like, their little Slack chats for spying on naughty tweeters and the like. And so I just think it's, like, got a lot to do with the fact that I was once a leftist or left adjacent. I think once you're in their crosshairs, it's very hard to step out of them.
to be released from your personal living hell.
Seriously. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. I never say anything that actually violates the rules, but we know that's not how it works anyway, so whatever. Just
actually, one of the things that's remarkable about you for somebody who did come over from the left is that you don't seem to have this, to me, a very obnoxious tick that a lot of people in the center left or like IDW sort of connected space, or even some of the former dirtbag leftists or whatever, they have this, like, this inability to prevent themselves from separating from the really bad people, right? So, I think the quintessential thing of this genre was that free speech letter signed by a bunch of people, including, like, Thomas Chatterton Williams, whose work I really like.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But,
yeah, that one.
It spent 3/4 of the letter denouncing Trump, and we're like, we know the left isn't this bad, but it's still bad, right? And you don't have any of that impulse. Like, why do you think you don't?
No, those people want leftism to be its best self. Like, they want better leftism. They want it without the excesses, without the parts that make it a little bit gauche, the parts that go a little bit too far. I'm under no illusions. Like, I think that, like, that kind of going too far and then having sort of, like, moderate leftists pretend that leftism itself is salvageable and good and noble, but they just went a little bit too far this time. I think that's sort of the prevailing, like, ethos with a lot of those people, but I think it's all kind of one and the same. I find that sort of lily-livered, like, unwilling, like, a total, like, unwillingness to just defend a principle on the basis of the principle, irrespective of who you happen to find in your camp as a result. Like, that to me is just ridiculous. Like, you don't need to degrade anyone or put anyone down or, like, mark out, like, who the bad people are to defend something as basic as freedom of expression. Like, you don't need to, buy brownie, like you don't need to sort of have this brownie point system where it's like, oh, you can defend free speech, but only if you spend half the thing like denouncing the naughty people on the right or whatever. It's just like stupid. The whole point of something like freedom of expression is that it needs to be like to a large extent like content independent, and like you want to be defending the speech of the people that you find most obnoxious, not like passing out, you know, whether someone's gone a little bit too far to like be granted their freedom, their freedom of expression. It's just like all this middling nonsense. Like, no, just back the principle and then it's easy. Then you don't have to worry about passing out all these like silly little situations or people or whatever.
Um, what happened to the left after Bernie's failure? Right? Because you're saying like there's not it seems like a lot of people went down this path of, and they had some critiques of the rising part of the left, which is, I don't want to use the word woke only because I keep repeating on this podcast, but like
Yeah.
I use the word woke because there's no better word, but it's so imprecise that it bothers me every time, and I feel
Yeah,
like
I know that feeling. I have the same reservations, but it is what it is, whatever.
but there's just no better word for it. But
Totally.
there were a lot of folks in that position in 2016 who, it seems like in 2015, a lot of them saw the problems, especially class-based problems, with the direction of the left. But
Right.
then, when Bernie sort of took a run at the crown and failed, they just completely folded on a lot of their objections. And it doesn't seem like there's much of a dissent anymore. Like even some of those figures, like Bernie himself, or even whatever. Like it seems like they've just changed their positions to be in line with the dominant woke left, and not like I don't know, how much resistance do you think there even is to any of this, like in any substantive form on the left?
Oh, I think the left is like in the most sort of um, conformist, like actually very, very rigid um, political orientation. And it's like there is no dissent. There is nobody that is allowed to disagree on anything. And they have this like totalizing kind of set of policing mechanisms that sort of act laterally and horizontally that keep everyone in line. And I think a huge part of what made my account sort of grow and people take notice of me during the primary, the Democrat primary in like 2019, 2020, is that I was the only one saying the bleeding obvious in terms of the fact that like both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren were competing for the same factions of voters and were also running on a fairly similar like left, sort of progressive, like somewhat popular, like economic populist sort of platform. And the fact is that they can't both be the nominee. And so it's kind of ridiculous that they're, going throughout the primary, like refusing to criticize one another. This is crazy to me. And I was saying the whole time, like, Liz Warren is going to eat Bernie's lunch. Like, I don't understand why anyone, like, why you're all ignoring her. This is so obvious. Like, what's wrong with you? Anyway, they all called me crazy for the better part of a year, tried to deplatform me. And then, like, it turns out that, yep, that's exactly what happened. Liz Warren went from like a 5% at the very beginning of the primary to like 32% or whatever. And she also shivved Bernie in terms of like calling him sexist and all that type of like absolute nonsense. And like, I just think that ultimately, like, the way what looks like internal competition within the party, and like sort of it really does look like dissent, and it looks like a sense of vibrancy within the party is actually just sort of like mutually constitutive factions of the same kind of electoral machine. And so the way I sort of look at it is that like Sanders never criticized Warren, not even one time throughout the primary. And that to me is crazy. So like they weren't competing. What they were doing is attracting the votes of slightly different factions of the Democrat base. And then, like, what that means is that even when they drop out of the actual race, they'll then sheepdog their specific portion of the base into voting for Joe Biden in the general. And I think that actually it's a very like team oriented thing, even though it seems like there's a lot of competition in the party. Like, do you remember a couple of years ago on, I think it was just after Super Tuesday, where they all basically all dropped out in rapid succession to give
Yeah, I
Biden
remember
the
that.
crown? Yeah. Yeah. I think that like the purpose was that Bernie would be able to collect this massive fraction of basically millennials that someone like a Joe Biden could never energize. But once Bernie and the sort of like influencers and like the people that are like Bernie world, once they got all those people sort of excited throughout the primary, then it was only a hop, skip, and a jump to get them to follow through to the general. Whereas if Sanders didn't run, then none of those millennials would have given a shit about that primary, really.
Yeah, I mean, he's given them a reason now with student loan forgiveness. I really think that's like the responsible for
Yes.
Democrats being able to turn out young voters in the midterms is literally just a direct bribe in some sense.
Yes, it literally is, and it's so funny, like, because I would argue with them about this, and it turned out to be such a like obvious tell because, like, on the one hand, these people were pushing a so-called like working class politics, and I did some pretty basic calculations. Like, it's not rocket science. This is blatantly like a wealth transfer from the lower middle class to like the upper middle class, and that to me is repulsive. Like, if you're pretending that what you're doing is something that's meant to be sort of like for the average Joe, like, why should a mechanic be paying Nathan Robinson's like third Ivy League de- um, degree? That's crazy. Like, I don't, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I like about how you think about these issues is that you are one of the best parsers, I think, of power and sort of power dynamics in sort of concert with psychology, right? So
Oh,
the way
thanks.
you just described the primary, right, which is like, okay, that this is a sort of false competition in order
Mm,
to psychologically invest young voters
yeah,
who
that's it.
have certain
Yeah.
leftist impulses. Like, you're really good at parsing that. This is something I think
Thanks.
is just like a huge deficit on the right. We don't think about power and we don't think about psychology almost at all. I feel like there's some exceptions, obviously, but
Hmm.
um,
Yeah, I think that's changing. I think there's like quite a few on the dissident right who are like much better at that than some of the sort of older old hat types.
yeah, I mean there are definitely exceptions. And more and
Mm.
more of it. It's so powerful because it's a good way of looking at the world. Because one of the things that really kind of, I don't know, cemented in my head that the way that you're looking at these things is almost always correct. Was the AOC trauma kind of incident
Oh
where
yes.
she was talking about how she was like sexually assaulted and therefore like this was totally
Yes, she was
traumatizing
so
her, but
manipulative.
she's a person in a position of power, essentially victimizing herself
Yeah.
or casting herself as a victim of her own sort of people who don't have anywhere
Mm.
near her level of power.
Yeah, I find it so disturbing. It's this like incredibly like popular tendency like on very much on the left, but I imagine it won't stay confined to the left. Nothing ever does. Where it's like these people in positions of like very real power who traditionally like the obligation that they have in view of the position that they're in is to exercise their power responsibly, like to perform a public duty or a public service or whatever that their job may be. But there's so many of these people who just like spend much of like their time in public life crying and like pretending to be victims and like acting as if they're oppressed when they're in positions of real power. And I think that's just such an alarming like asymmetry, because if you as a person in power are purporting to be powerless and victimized, like how do we hold you accountable for the power that you wield? Because when you are wielding power, if anyone tries to hold you accountable, you start crying and pretending that the person is like sexist or racist or whatever. It's just like this total like Teflon like inability to hold someone accountable if that's the way they're going to conduct themselves. It's crazy to me.
Do you think that, I mean, like, it seems to be a really successful mode of politics, right? The success of AOC in the Democratic Party, but I think you're right. Like, there's no way this is going to be confined just to the left. Eventually, you know, what works will be adopted, but I mean, what are the consequences of a politics where the people in power are able to cast themselves as victims of, like, let's say in a democracy, right? Like, representatives are able to cast themselves as victims traumatized by voters.
Well, I think first off, it allows them to basically like act as if, you know, their opponents in the House are actually not just, you know, enemies of the Democrat Party, but enemies of humanity. And you know, whatever it is that they stand for is actually like metaphysically evil, and the battle is not against, you know, Josh Hawley of Missouri. It's against like these like Confederate white men who are damaging our democracy or whatever. Like they just basically cast everything in these like totally like Marvel Cinematic Universe terms with like these, you know, incredibly binary like comic book villains and heroes and this sort of thing. And it just, oh yeah, I mean, I think it has really troubling implications if, you know, you can sort of conflate your political opponents with these sort of like metaphysical forms of like evil, and you know, act as if there are these like incredibly grand narratives to which like you're just this like damsel in distress, and like anything that your opponent does is just, yeah, totally like not just like, you know, mobilizing sort of opposition to you, but mobilizing something illegitimate against all people like yourself, if that makes sense. So like I remember a couple of years ago, in relation to AOC, there was that time where I believe it was Ted Yoho called AOC a bitch on the stairs of like outside Congress, which is like, you know, obviously that's not an appropriate thing to call one of your colleagues. Like it's, you know, momentary slip, you fucked up. Like you should not speak to colleagues that way. Like I don't care what sex or gender or whatever they are. It's just like rude and unnecessary, and he should have said sorry. Like he made a mistake, which is, these things happen. But like it sort of stunned me at least that like this is someone with whom AOC works on a day-to-day basis. And rather than sort of like, you know, giving him any kind of dignity, allowing him to say sorry, allowing him to sort of like attempt to make up for doing something wrong, she had to pounce on it immediately and commodify it into like this massive like speech, wherein she could sort of like tie the sort of emotions of everyone in the country, every woman in the country, at least every girl in the country. She could sort of like recruit all of their emotions, all of their like sort of animosity towards men, all of their sort of like, yeah, girl power, whatever. And just turn it into this like ongoing sort of speech that she could sort of build this sort of like victim capital from? And it's just like, I don't know. I can imagine that that's not the kind of environment in which like people are going to be capable of working together. It's like anything you do can be blown up instantly into just this like trauma trauma credibility, you know, rather than just sort of like giving someone a chance to say sorry, sort of, you know, having a bit of like humility, giving someone a chance. Like, you know, at the end of the day, like, again, I'm not excusing it, but like, you probably have to antagonize your colleagues pretty badly to get, you know, a fellow house member to call you a bitch, which again doesn't justify it, but like the inability to sort of look at your own behavior in any way and just instantly do this whole like binary victim antagonist nonsense. It just seems to me so antithetical to actually getting anything done for anyone other than yourself. It just seems such a like promotional hustler move as opposed to being something that like actually does anything for anyone else.
Yeah, Yuval Levin has made this point in the like much less sort of internal psychological way about how institutions are just platforms for individuals now. Like there's no sense of accountability, responsibility, like subhuming yourself to an office or like any way through which you could actually responsibly wield power and be held accountable for the decisions that you make. That's all sort of done, right? It's now like Congress is now a platform for AOC,
Yeah.
and like this guy losing his cool with her over some unrelated thing is now her next like platform to
Yeah.
make herself
To leverage
the
off.
victim
Yeah.
and to take all the ironically like to sort of sap in all that power that comes with that, because as you say, it's just you know identifying herself with this very much larger group and every like woman who's ever been done wrong by a man, you know what I mean, like, and that has nothing to do, they're probably arguing over whether the government should do X or Y, right? Like that should not
Yeah.
be a matter of sort of psychological
It's got
terrorism.
nothing to do. It's got nothing to do with gender. Like she was being a bitch, and you shouldn't have called her a bitch. But like she was being a bitch. Maybe she could like think about her own behavior. Like you have to like for one of your colleagues to call you a name like that. Like you have to have done something pretty bloody annoying. And like sure, they're still in the wrong. They still shouldn't do that. But like have enough humility and grace to be willing to sort of recognize that if someone's getting mad or really frustrated, it's you've done whatever it is to frustrate them. Try to treat other people with decency instead of just looking at them as like a potential commodity, a potential moment that you can leverage into, yeah, even more of this like victimhood capital.
Yeah, well, the worst part about it is that it makes the exercise of power covert.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
It's not.
Absolutely.
It completely like it completely eliminates. In some sense, it's better if even if there are, for example, tyrannical laws being passed, it's kind of clear and open in the open, and I do think the bureaucracy and technocracy have a lot to do with sort of obscuring the sources of power, but just on a pure like individual and sort of again psychological level, it's like this gaslighting thing where somebody's exercising power over you, but they're saying like ow you're hurting me, right? Like it's
Oh
obviously
yeah,
way worse.
absolutely.
I don't remember which
Yeah.
congressman this was, but like it was obviously way worse for him to have like this episode blasted out to the world than
Oh,
it was
so
for her to
humiliating.
hear
It was
him
so
call her that.
unnecessary. Yeah, it was so unnecessary for her to do that. Like, it just was, it seemed to me such a tyrannical, like, manipulative and unnecessary abuse of power. Like, your colleague made a mistake. He fucked up. You don't need to humiliate him. You don't need to do this. Like, just stop. And the other thing that was crazy is that this was during the pandemic, and part of the genesis of the argument had been something to do with some kind of like feeding, like some kind of maybe a school lunch program or something to do with like charitable, some kind of charitable food project, some kind, whatever. This Congressman Ted Yoho had actually been on the board of a charity that did some kind of like I can't remember. It's like feeding homeless people or something to do with like homeless youth, something like this. He'd been on the board of that charity for like 20 years and had done a lot of work with like actually put his money where his mouth is and like was being like a good citizen. And that particular charity fired him from the board because of like the dishonor associated with like his calling AOC a name.
Yeah, I mean, is there any way to actually stop this kind of sort of jujitsu from constantly happening?
Yes,
'Cause it seems like
yes, you
whoever
have
does
to
this holds the
have to
like
laugh at these
card.
people. They need to be mocked to their face immediately because they're always lying. And the moment that somebody is prepared to laugh at it instead of giving it any reverence, then it collapses. Like these people aren't victims; they should be laughed at. And I think that like the I think incredibly conspicuous increase in the amount of policing of comedy that has gone on over the last few years is like not an accident. I think so much of this nonsense is so pompous, ridiculous, that all it takes is somebody sort of mocking it even just slightly and it falls apart. And that's why these people like need to silence anyone who criticizes them, anyone who calls anything into question. Like, by the same token, part of sort of what started my, you know, getting exiled from the left eventually was like when Me Too happened. I just sort of, it was so obvious to me instantly that like this wasn't some kind of like anti oppression movement that was like from the streets, some kind of like oppressed group like fighting for their rights or whatever. This is just like angry career women who are just like spitefully lashing out at men that had jobs they wanted. Like, which is not, I know that there were a couple at the outset that had like real merit. And I don't want to pretend that someone like who was the first? Weinstein is obviously like awful, and there were a few others, but it sort of got to a point where that just this rolling bitch hunt that went on and on and on and on forever. It's just like, well, it's pretty clear what's going on here. Is that like any enterprising young woman who wants to make a name for herself in like New York like liberal media just has to come along and like cry about some like middle-aged white guy who did something wrong one time allegedly, and she'll have like a golden ticket handed to her, and that's like such a like contemptible and like illegitimate way to you know um like you shouldn't be rewarding things like that. Like if you've been sexually assaulted, that's awful and I'm so sorry, but like go to the police or sue the person. You can go to the media and tell these like salacious stories. That's like that's what you do when it doesn't pass muster with police or courts or anyone else. It's so obvious that like what they're seeking from all of these things is just like victim capital, like the ability to pretend to be somebody who is downtrodden, somebody who's oppressed or whatever, so that then they can berate people and abuse their power and demand things that they wouldn't otherwise be granted.
Do you think there are real instances of fragility in this? Because I go back and forth on this. Like, clearly somebody like AOC is very calculated about how she puts on this performance, right? It's very clearly to advance her own profile and power. But like, especially the really younger set of Gen Z,
I actually
wondering if they're
even
that
think
fragile for real.
I think somebody like AOC actually, like, ironically, sure, like the machine infrastructure, the party infrastructure around her is like very deliberate, blah blah blah. But I think that like people like AOC, like she's just like a glib narcissist. She's actually relatively sincere. She believes her own bullshit. I think. Like, I don't think it's as insincere as we would like to believe. Like, I think it's not as calculated. It's not calculated as such. It's that she basically, people like her are always flying by the seat of their pants in terms of protecting their ego. Like, that's always the number one thing that they need to do. They need to sort of inflate their own ego with this like grandiose rhetoric and bullshit. They need to get attention. Um, and they need to sort of afford themselves some kind of like moral or political sort of um, power or entitlement. They sort of have these fantasies, like grandiose fantasies of a kind of entitlement and specialness and uniqueness and blah blah blah. But like, I don't think she's faking as such. I think she just has like a very shallow like commitment to the things that she says. So like people like her will say something this week and then say the opposite in like 3 weeks time, and she won't relate the two to each other or feel as if she's contradicted herself in any way. It's like she's just seeking that sort of like ego validation at all times. So that's basically like the continuity throughout it.
What 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 is it about our society or about our culture that creates so many more of these kinds of people, whether they're narcissists or
The cluster B
yeah.
psychos. um, I mean, this is just my sort of rough and tumble like um, thesis. I think it is attachment difficulties. I think it is like attachment problems, like and kind of um, emotionally unavailable or engulfing parents. I think that this sort of like helicopter parenting and like all that sort of you know obsessive like planning of your kids like life and time and like extracurricular activities, all that nonsense. Like, sure, you seem like an attentive parent, but like actually what most kids need for most of their childhood is sort of like space and time to play and explore things and sort of grow and figure things out. They don't need sort of like an incredibly regimented like series of like extracurriculars and like an inability to ever have any time away from like mum or other people that are sort of like telling them what to do. Like kids need to be able to play and explore and that sort of thing. And I think like an inability to sort of explore the world on your own terms in your own time with other people your age, I think that does enormous damage to kids. And I also think that like parents who are too focused on their own bullshit and on imagining their child as an extension of their own ego rather than a small and growing person who will someday be independent of them. Like, you really need to equip your kids to like think for themselves and develop personality, and like you need to validate them for them, not validate them for like stupid achievements with school or whatever. Like, I don't know. I just think that like there's a lot of objectification that goes on. Like sort of parents will sort of reward and punish their children according to their ability to kind of live up to mom or dad's fantasies rather than sort of giving your kids the space to sort of become people in their own right. And I think that does like incredible damage, because if you don't have like a very healthy like attachment figures as a kid, if you feel like you need to constantly like protect yourself from like shame or fear or danger in the home, whether it be emotional danger or like actual physical violence, whatever, like if you don't get like really secure like if you don't have very like secure attachment to your primary like caregivers, that just plays out in a million retarded ways later on in life. It means that like you're constantly going to be looking for this like shallow ego validation rather than having the ability to sort of regulate your own emotions and like value certain things more than the sort of like immediate gratification that like ego validation provides.
Well, I think another way of framing what you just said might be that there's no status or reward for parents for just in the culture at large for raising
Hmm.
just like a virtuous, stable person, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no reward for character or virtue. Like if you raise a solid human being who, doesn't do sort of amazing in school or go to the best college, but grows up and gets a job and works hard and marries and has children of their own. There's no status or reward, or at least not like from the larger culture. That person is viewed as a failure, and you're viewed as a failure as a parent in a lot of circles. I mean, I grew up in Palo Alto, and like
Hmm.
you'd be viewed as a failure for raising a child like that if he or she didn't have a bunch of other academic or sort of financial or whatever achievements that go alongside of that. But it seems like
Hmm.
that's the most endangered kind of person now, is just raising like if you have somebody who's a wreck, like a narcissistic wreck who can't form decent relationships, can't take responsibility for their actions, can't, like, that's the failure, not somebody who didn't go to Harvard. But there's not a lot of recognition, especially in elite circles, I think, of America, about like what's actually a failure as a parent is if you can't launch your child into an independent and stable life, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I agree, but like, I think there is, and I mean, I'm really apprehensive about like how do you frame what I'm about to say because I do imagine that like at every moment throughout history, sort of, um, people attempted to sort of say, oh, there's something, quite novel happening in our particular moment in history. So, look, like I'm aware that maybe it's not novel, maybe it's always been this way, but it does feel to me at least a lot like so many of the institutions in whether it be Australia or the United States, like so many of the institutions of like countries that I love Australia. Like, I love the States too. I've been there a bunch. Like I actually like my country. Like I don't want to feel as though all of the institutions that govern my country are basically rewarding this like incredibly like shameless, spineless, like backstabbing, like sniping, horrible behavior, and will like elevate, the worst people on earth for doing horrible things, and will like punish and like and shun and ostracize like good and decent people with like moral integrity. They'll get like, they'll find themselves living in the Ecuadorian embassy, or getting asylum in Russia or whatever. You know what I mean? It seems like this like an incredibly weird time where like some of the most ridiculous people in society are being sort of propped up and like given all these accolades. And I don't know. I feel like does it, at any point like does this stop? Does it, or does it just keep getting sillier? Because it feels pretty silly. Like the last few years have felt very weird.
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, it's a comfort that things that can't go on forever won't. I don't think you can
Mm.
continually be this silly, and
I think so
like
too. I hope so. That sort of remains my abiding kind of, yeah.
yeah, but it's not that much of a comfort, because usually the way that those things end is by some other like society coming in and collapsing yours and just taking over, or in the case of the Soviet Union, you can stay silly a long time, right? And especially because America is so rich, and Australia is also like a very rich country by the standards of the world, right? Um, if you're really rich, you can continue to be silly for a long time before everything comes crashing down. But it does feel that way. Like even this week, right? Like the FAA had to ground all the flights. Like they just screwed up on such a monumental level that they had to ground all flights in America for hours. And obviously this screwed up a ton of,
No
sort of
kidding.
ancillary. Like it seems like we can't perform basic functions anymore.
Right. Yeah,
There's
it's
this like pervasive sense of that nothing works, that everything is
mm,
broken, nothing actually functions.
mm.
You know.
It's yeah, it's like I've never been fully persuaded by that sort of like singularity nonsense, but like I do think there's something to be said for the fact that like as increased as sort of as um cognitive sort of skills that most sort of citizens in like an educated Western country would have like developed automatically in the 20th century. Um, these sort of we no longer develop them because we can sort of outsource them to the iPhone in our pocket or whatever, and like apply that to a whole bunch of other forms of technology that basically like do a whole bunch of things for us that previously would have had to do for ourselves. Like, it does seem rather sort of like strange to me, at least. Increasingly, I realize how like so many of my millennial peers literally cannot do basic math. Um, they can't spell. They can't do sort of like problem solving, like basic sort of lateral thinking, basic like problem solving. And it seems to me that like no matter how, to whatever extent technology can take over a bunch of different like functions or things on behalf of us, like there will still always be like human beings running these systems. And like if we don't know how to like think critically or like don't have the balls to say, hang on, I think something is wrong here, and be willing to stand up and say that at like the moment when it's salient rather than 2, 6, 12 months later. It just, I don't know, it seems like there's these fairly basic ideas about like what it means to be like a decent person, having like some moral integrity, being honest, like not being sort of like a backstabbing, disloyal rat. It just seems crazy to me that all these like very basic things seem to be sort of like actively selected against in like a lot of our institutions. It seems like that's not something that is sustainable in any way. Like,
I was thinking today that the AI singularity might be going the other way. Like, I don't know if this might be
just
completely
everything
crazy, but
crashing all the time.
no, but that that we're becoming more like AI. I was watching, and this is reminiscent of some. I think it was in the New York Times, maybe a year ago or something. But it was like how to break up with your friend, or how to tell your friend
Oh
that
my god,
you don't
those
have
scripts.
you
Yes.
don't have any like bandwidth for them right now, and
Oh my
you
gosh, yes.
can't handle
That,
it. Like
yes.
it's like training people to speak to each other like AIs, and it ties back to the whole AOC thing, right? Like she just took that and turned it into a marketable sort of internet moment. People are doing that, even people who don't have the incentive for power or platform that AOC has. It's
Because,
like
like,
they're
these
turning
people
their
lack
interaction into
basic
AI.
social skills. Like, they literally lack basic, like, social and communicative skills. They don't know how to, like, ask for what they want and to, like, say yes or turn something down when they don't want something. That's sort of, again, like, to throw back to me too. It seemed to be so much of the sort of like crybaby discourse surrounding that was sort of amounted to these pieces where women were effectively, you know, essentially like felt confronted by the fact that midway through some kind of encounter, they'd realized they didn't want to go further. And rather than just sort of explicitly sort of um, calling it off or like leaving, they seem to sort of get increasingly resentful as like the other party, the guy, couldn't read their mind. It's just like, honey, you need to be capable of disappointing somebody when if you're not interested in them. Like you can't, go along with somebody's advances on you, um, and then sort of change your mind and not communicate that and then hold it against them. Like you need to be capable of actually taking the initiative, like sort of being assertive and being capable of sort of disappointing people sometimes too. It seems so much of this is just like a sort of inability to or unwillingness to sort of disappoint people and to say no in sort of basic social interactions. It's
Yeah,
just
those are
like
really
another
good.
one of those recently where the one that I saw, and I think you saw when I posted it. It was like these girls who like were writing these scripts by which like men were allowed to talk to them in a bar. Like a guy is supposed to come up and say like, I'm so sorry if this is weird, but may I please flirt with you? Stuff like this.
Yeah, it's
And
just
I will leave right away if you are not interested. It's like you don't need to ask somebody that you flirt with them and then they can turn you down. They can make it apparent that they're not interested. That's sort of like what social discourse is. But these women like set up all these like insane hoops for people to jump through so that they don't have to sort of reject someone, basically. It's just like, no, honey, you like part of being an adult is that sometimes you have to disappoint other people if you're not as interested in them as they are in you. And that doesn't feel good. And you should try to do it gently and kindly, but that's what it is to be an adult. You can't just like stay quiet and pretend to be interested in someone, make out with them, and then sort of decide that you don't want to do that anymore, but not make that outwardly apparent to the other person.
Yeah, there's such a good example of exactly what you're talking about. There was one of these cases, a Title IX case on a college campus, and this is several years ago,
Right.
where like a girl, you know, was hooking up with a guy, got completely naked,
Mhm.
got into his bed, and then, she accused him of sexually assaulting her when she was just like, oh, it felt less awkward to just let it continue. Well, I mean, sure. I mean, I bet it is pretty awkward once you're naked and in bed with
You
someone to
are
disappoint
naked
them,
in
as
his
you would say,
bed.
but
Is this a
that's your
joke?
job, you know? If you're not into the interaction,
Like,
either
what did
that or
you
you have
think
to
you were
live with
doing
it.
when you took your clothes off and got into his bed naked?
Like, I
There's
fully
a
believe it's more awkward to say no at that point, but still, like, that's your, if you're not, we actually have women have a tremendous amount of power because most guys are good men, and certainly don't want to force a woman against her will, but it's your responsibility then to just
no, they're all
suck it up and
psyops
be
into that
awkward.
awful. You know, most guys like even like not even like soy beta males or whatever, like even just normal guys these days are like so like affirmative consenty. Like I just this idea of like patriarchy or rape culture is preposterous. Like it, definitely not the case. It is difficult though to change your mind in the midst of something and then to sort of basically have to reckon with like, it is a moral quandary and you yourself have to decide like whether you'd rather suck it up and sort of do something that you don't want to do to save it, like rather than sort of go through some kind of like awkward situation in order to like leave that environment or end that encounter. But that's what it means to be a big girl. Like, you need to make decisions and like reckon with the implications that flow from them. Like, this is pretty basic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you say is just basic. Like it's things that would be readily accepted and obvious, which is funny why you keep getting banned for saying it, but these are things that would be accepted as obvious even even for sure 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. You say anything prudent, like I don't know, maybe don't get like shit faced drunk when going out. Like when or like, make sure that you sort of don't put yourself into situations that are sort of dangerous or where you'll be vulnerable or where your decision making capacity is sort of compromised below a level that you can feel good about. Like these sorts of things that are just like sensible advice, obviously, are so quickly framed as like, oh, you're victim blaming, you're like a rape apologist. It's just like nobody thinks that rape is okay. And if they actually think that, they're not the ones talking about this particular issue. They'll stay quiet about it because they know that they're the outlier. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like all this, like, sort of nonsense, like, Orwellian, like, language policing and, like, binary framing of things makes it impossible to just be, like, sensible and normal in the way that you talk about certain things. And it just, like, has all these toxic flow on effects. Like, I don't know. I'm quite troubled by some of the Title IX stuff, especially like there were a few years ago certain cases are starting to basically move from the sort of kangaroo courts set up on the universities through to being actually litigated in courts of law. And it seems like a terrible thing to me that like totally non-transparent, like shadowy sort of process that takes place on the universities for that to then be like transported into the proper like adversarial legal system is pretty troubling.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, still in the legal system, like there's been a lot of successes of mostly men who have sued in the federal courts and
Yes,
won
that's
under
good.
denial of due process. But it all
Mm,
operates, I mean, very much in what what you've described as covert power. It all operates in this
mm,
space between the formal courts
mm,
and the
mm.
sort of court of public opinion where it's kind of like being accused of a crime, but not really. And so therefore they can hide behind the notion that, oh, actually nothing's really happening to you if you're
Yeah, nothing's
smeared in the
happening to
public
you. You're just
as a
imagining
rapist,
things. Yeah.
like they pretend that basically they're not doing anything to you all the while, you get expelled from school, you lose like your ability to get a job, your entire social circle is pretty much required to shun you, right? Like, and then all the while, there's these people saying, "Well, we're not doing anything to you because you're not going to jail," right? And
Of course you are.
there's
It's a social death. You're destroying somebody. Destroying somebody's reputation is like a heinous thing to do. And I just, that again with the sort of media and the, women doing these sort of like traumatized crybaby nonsense. It's like we have court of law for a reason. That's because it preserves the presumption of innocence. Like whatever sort of claims you're making should be subject to rule of evidence. Like I don't want the fucking BuzzFeed intern to be the person who decides whether or not like this seems like a legitimate case. You know what I mean? It's like anyone could sell kind of a story arc, but that's not how we do things in a decent society. Like, you know, even if you hate men, all these men that you accuse illegitimately of sexual assault and whose lives you destroy, they have mothers and daughters and wives and sisters. Like, the impact of this shit is massive. And it just seems um, really brutal that these women could, like, do that kind of thing in such a cavalier manner, and like all these sort of like legacy media outlets and then some of the online ones too, that they'll all just go along with this and sort of yell and shriek at anyone who dares question anything, or dares even question sort of the internal logic of the quote unquote movement. It's like I'm not even calling any specific person a liar. It's just that like any system that will involve like airing accusations against specific people, like through a sort of mediatized discourse that has like very real rewards for the person casting the accusations, very real costs for the accused, and then like basically no procedural fairness, no due process, nothing. Like it just seems like a terrible thing to want to kind of normalize. Like you should want to kind of reject that way of doing quote unquote justice. Even if it's in the public square, you should want it to be, not brutal like that. Like, I don't know. I've dealt with like, I think most women have either like had some kind of like traumatic sexual assault experience, or may know a friend or friend of a friend who has. Like this is not something entirely remote to all of us, and that's why it seems to me like incumbent on us to not whittle those really like that it's really serious to make claims of sexual assault against somebody. Like that's not something you should do flippantly. Like, and it just again like I just in my personal experience, like the desire to want to go to the media and like expose all your sort of like all this nonsense to the media just seems to me like antithetical to what people who've actually reckoned with something really like any kind of brutal assault. Like people want to deal with it and move on. Like they don't want to go and sort of bask in the limelight of like all these stupid liberal like papers or outlets or whatever.
Yeah, I feel like the circle has come back here at to let you go in a minute. So our hour is up, but I really feel like the theme of everything you've said, and I could add a bunch of other examples, not just in the sexual assault context, but I mean, even Yoel Roth at Twitter, right? Or the group chats that are focused on
Yeah.
shaming, making sure that Aimee Terese doesn't get to say these things, right? Like it's the
Whoa.
exercise of power completely outside of democratic or even any other kind of accountability here.
Mm. Mm. And it's like, I mean, even to some extent, um, the sort of old school, like, libertarians of a kind, especially even people like, I don't know if you know the psychologist, Thomas Sass. Um, Even so, like, even libertarian like himself, it's like in the 20th century, like people who didn't want sort of overbearing state control, blah blah, like regulation, etc. They had like a sense of personal propriety. Like, sure, they may not want like this overweening like nanny state, but by the same token, they knew that meant like you had to exercise responsibility for yourself and sort of um be a decent human being in sort of the public square in order for that to like be a functional system. Whereas it just seems now that it just like um no matter where a lot of these people sort of land on the, anywhere from like the liberal to far left, whatever, there just seems to be a total like hostility or just like rejection of any kind of like sense of, transcendent like moral principles of any kind. It just seems like everything's relative. Like, do whatever you want. Like, the ends justify the means. Just, yeah, I don't know. I really hope that that's something that can start to shift in the forthcoming years, because that seems to me like a pretty scary prospect if it goes on the way it's going.
Well, people can get more of Aimee Terese by, I would say, following her on Twitter, except she has a Substack, a specter hunting leftism, which is an appropriate name. So you can
Yeah.
subscribe to her thoughts over there. Hopefully she'll be back on Twitter soon. She seems to be caught in a constant, she's like Schrodinger's Twitter account, constantly
Yeah.
caught in between.
Yeah, I'll be back. Don't worry. It's never permanent.
And then you can catch her podcast when it does launch. Do you have any idea of when that might launch?
Yeah, my co-host is going overseas during February, so probably March, early March.
So you can catch her there finally, and hopefully she won't get banned from Apple Podcasts immediately.
Oh yeah, no, I've remained safe on most other platforms, so they haven't given me the full Alex Jones treatment yet. So fingers crossed.
Well, thank you. So you'll never get that treatment here. So thanks for coming on, Aimee.
Thank you. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.